Officers humiliate a veteran in a diner, but when they see it on his desk. Stay until the end of the video to experience the song Honor's Echo that perfectly captures the heart of this story. Don't miss it. The autumn rain drummed steadily against the large windows of Murphy's Diner, a long-standing establishment in the heart of Boston's historic district, and chrome-trimmed countertops that had witnessed decades of late-night conversations and early morning coffees. James "Jimmy" Sullivan, a 68-year-old Vietnam veteran, sat in his usual corner booth, his weathered hands wrapped around a steaming cup of black coffee. The booth, positioned perfectly to observe both the entrance and the kitchen doors, had been his regular spot for the past 15 years. The owners, Mike and Sarah Murphy, always kept it reserved for him during his daily morning visits, a small gesture of respect for a man who had become more family than customer. The diner's walls told stories of their own, framed newspaper clippings from significant moments in Boston's history, vintage Red Sox memorabilia, and a few carefully preserved photographs of local heroes. Among them, though most patrons never noticed, was a faded picture of a young Jimmy Sullivan receiving the Silver Star, tucked away in a modest frame near the coffee station. He never mentioned it to anyone, and the current staff, mostly college students working part-time, had no idea that the quiet old man in the corner was the same young soldier in the photograph. This morning, Jimmy's crisp white dress shirt and carefully pressed slacks stood out among the usual crowd of early morning workers in their casual attire. A small American flag pin adorned his collar, and his silver hair was neatly combed, betraying his military background in its precision. On the aged wooden table before him lay a stack of papers, meticulously organized, and a worn leather briefcase that had seen better days rested against the booth's bench. The breakfast rush was in full swing, with the clatter of plates and murmur of conversations filling the air. The aroma of bacon and coffee created that unmistakable diner atmosphere that had remained unchanged for generations. Sarah Murphy, now in her 50s with streaks of gray in her dark hair, moved efficiently between tables, sharing warm smiles and friendly banter with her regular customers. When the door chimed, announcing new arrivals, Jimmy glanced up out of habit. 3 police officers entered, shaking off the rain from their uniform jackets. They were young, probably in their early 30s, carrying themselves with the confident air that came with the badge. Officer Michael Reynolds, Officer Thomas Blake, and Officer David Morrison were well known in the precinct for their exemplary record in drug busts and their recent promotions to the narcotics division. As they settled into a nearby booth, their voices carried across the diner, discussing their latest case and the upcoming department ceremony. Jimmy couldn't help but overhear their conversation, not out of curiosity, but because their voices grew increasingly loud as they warmed up to their surroundings. He noticed Sarah approaching their table with fresh coffee, her usual warm smile in place. The morning light struggled to pierce through the heavy clouds outside, creating a somewhat somber atmosphere inside the diner. The rain had picked up, and the sound of thunder rumbled in the distance. Jimmy began organizing his papers, his movements deliberate and practiced, each document finding its precise place in his system. His coffee had grown cold, but he was too absorbed in his task to notice. The officers' laughter grew louder as they shared stories from their recent operations, their voices carrying an edge of superiority that made some of the other patrons shift uncomfortably in their seats. Sarah refilled Jimmy's cup without being asked, giving him a knowing look that spoke of years of shared understanding. She had seen him at this same table through countless mornings, through good days and bad, through celebrations and sorrows. Traffic outside had begun to build, with cars sending sprays of water onto the sidewalk as they passed. The city was coming fully awake now, and the diner's rhythm shifted as the breakfast crowd began to thin out, making way for the mid-morning regulars. Through it all, Jimmy remained focused on his papers, his pen moving steadily across the pages, making careful notations in margins with a precision that spoke of years of practiced discipline. Little did anyone know that this ordinary rainy morning at Murphy's Diner was about to become anything but ordinary. The interaction that would unfold between the veteran and the 3 officers would soon shake the foundations of their understanding of service, sacrifice, and judgment. The stack of papers on Jimmy's desk held secrets that would transform this simple diner into a stage for a profound lesson in humility and respect. The rhythmic sound of rain against the windows provided a steady backdrop as Jimmy methodically reviewed his documents. Each paper represented a different veteran's case, men and women who had served their country and now needed help navigating the complexities of the VA system. For 15 years, since retiring from his position as a high school history teacher, Jimmy had dedicated his mornings to this volunteer work, helping fellow veterans claim the benefits they'd earned through their service. His small office, tucked away in a modest community center several blocks from the diner, wasn't much. Just a desk, 2 chairs, and walls lined with military memorabilia and thank you cards. But it was there that he had helped hundreds of veterans piece together their lives after service. The diner had become his unofficial second office, a place where he could review cases in peace before heading to meet with veterans who needed his expertise. Today's stack was particularly important. Among the papers was the case of Maria Gonzalez, a young Afghanistan veteran struggling with PTSD and facing eviction. Another file belonged to Frank Chen, an elderly Korean War veteran who had recently discovered he might be eligible for additional benefits but couldn't navigate the paperwork alone. Each case represented a life, a story, and a chance to make a difference. The officers' voices continued to carry across the diner, their tone growing increasingly boisterous as they discussed their recent accomplishments. "Did you see that junkie's face when we kicked down his door?" Officer Reynolds laughed, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "These street rats think they're so clever, but they're all the same in the end." Jimmy's hand paused briefly over his paperwork, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. He had seen too many veterans fall into addiction after returning home, their wounds both visible and invisible leading them down paths they never would have chosen otherwise. The officer's casual dismissal of human suffering, regardless of circumstances, struck a deep chord within him. Sarah appeared at his table again, this time with a fresh slice of apple pie, on the house as always. She had noticed his slight reaction to the officer's conversation. "You okay, Jimmy?" she asked quietly, her voice carrying the weight of 15 years of friendship. He nodded, offering a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. The morning light had strengthened, despite the continuing rain, illuminating the small American flag pin on Jimmy's collar. It caught Officer Blake's attention, and he nudged his colleagues. "Check out Grandpa over there," he smirked, keeping his voice low, but not low enough. "Probably one of those guys who wears the pin but never served. You see them all the time, trying to get military discounts at stores." Officer Morrison chuckled, adding, "Yeah, and look at all that paperwork, probably working on his conspiracy theories about the government. These old-timers love their conspiracies." The third officer, Reynolds, simply shook his head with a patronizing smile, turning his attention back to his breakfast. The diner had grown quieter, the remaining patrons uncomfortably aware of the officer's comments. Sarah's hands tightened around the coffee pot she was holding, her knuckles turning white. She knew Jimmy's story, knew about the nightmares that still plagued him 50 years after Vietnam, knew about the medals he kept in a shoebox under his bed because he couldn't bear to display them. Through the front windows, the city continued its morning routine. A school bus splashed through a puddle, its yellow sides bright against the gray day. A woman hurried past with a newspaper held over her head, and a delivery truck double-parked briefly to unload supplies to the boutique next door. Life went on, oblivious to the tension building inside Murphy's diner. Jimmy continued his work, his expression unchanged, though his shoulders had squared slightly, a subtle shift that only those who knew him well would notice. His pen moved across the papers with the same steady precision, but now each movement carried a hint of additional purpose, as if each signature and notation was an act of defiance against the dismissive attitudes behind him. On his table, beside the neat stacks of papers, sat a small, worn photograph he always carried. Himself and his best friend, Tommy Martinez, taken just days before Tommy stepped on a landmine outside Saigon. The photo was weathered and creased from years of being carried in wallets and briefcases, but the young faces still smiled out with the innocent confidence of youth, unaware of what lay ahead. The officers' breakfast plates were nearly empty now. their coffee cups requiring yet another refill. Their conversation had shifted to complaints about the entitled younger generation and how people these days don't understand real respect. The irony of their words hung heavy in the air, unnoticed by those who spoke them, but painfully apparent to everyone else in the diner. Sarah made her way back to Jimmy's table, refreshing his coffee with deliberate slowness, her movements a quiet act of solidarity. As she poured, Officer Reynolds's voice cut through the diner's ambient noise once again. "Hey, what's the deal with the reserved sign on this booth? Think you're special or something, old-timer?" His question carried a mocking edge that made several nearby patrons shift uncomfortably in their seats. Jimmy looked up from his papers for the first time, his blue eyes meeting the officer's gaze steadily. Years of combat and decades of helping troubled veterans had given him an ability to remain calm in tense situations. "Just a kind gesture from the owners," he replied simply, his voice carrying the slight roughness of age but maintaining the clear authority that had once commanded men in battle. Officer Blake leaned forward in his booth, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "Must be nice having your own private office here, playing with your little papers, wearing your little flag pin. You know, some of us actually work for a living, protecting the streets while others just pretend to be important." The diner had grown eerily quiet. Even the usual clatter from the kitchen seemed muted, as if the whole establishment was holding its breath. A young waitress stopped mid-stride, coffee pot frozen in her hand. The tension in the air was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. "3 weeks ago," Officer Morrison chimed in, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "we busted this guy who claimed he was a veteran. Had all sorts of papers too, just like you. Turned out he was running a drug operation from his basement. Maybe we should take a closer look at what you're working on there, Pops." Jimmy's hand remained steady as he placed his pen down beside his papers. The morning light caught the edge of a small scar on his right hand, a souvenir from a jungle firefight half a century ago. His fingers brushed against the edge of a document, a VA appeal for a young Marine who'd lost both legs in Afghanistan. "Young man," Jimmy spoke finally, his voice quiet but carrying an unmistakable weight. "I've been sitting in this booth every morning for 15 years. In that time, I've helped hundreds of veterans navigate the system that owes them so much but often gives them so little. These papers you're so curious about? They're the lifelines of men and women who served their country, and now need someone to fight for them in a different kind of battle." Officer Reynolds scoffed, pushing his empty plate away. "Right, because pushing papers is the same as actually protecting people. We're out there every day, dealing with real threats while you sit here playing hero with your paperwork and your little flag pin." The rain outside had intensified, drumming against the windows with increased fury. A flash of lightning illuminated the diner briefly, followed by a low rumble of thunder that seemed to underscore the growing tension. Sarah stood by the counter, her hands clenched around a dish rag, watching the scene unfold with a mixture of anger and concern. "You know what I think?" Officer Blake stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He took a few steps toward Jimmy's booth, his badge catching the light. "I think you're just another one of those guys who likes to play dress-up, wearing patriotic pins and pretending to be something you're not. We see it all the time, wannabes trying to get attention or free stuff." Jimmy remained seated, his posture straight but relaxed, a calm center in the storm of hostility. His eyes flickered briefly to an old photo on the diner wall, the one by the coffee station that most people never noticed. Then his gaze returned to the officers, carrying decades of seen and unseen battles in its depths. "The real heroes," Officer Morrison continued, joining his colleague in standing, "are out there right now, putting their lives on the line. Not sitting in diners all day, playing with papers and living off other people's respect. Maybe it's time someone called you out on your act." The other patrons in the diner had gone completely still. A businessman in a suit had paused with his fork halfway to his mouth. A young couple by the window held hands tightly under their table. Even the cook had emerged from the kitchen, watching through the service window with concern etched on his face. Sarah stepped forward, about to intervene, but Jimmy raised his hand slightly, a subtle gesture that stopped her in her tracks. She recognized it from years of friendship. He had something to say, and he would say it in his own time, in his own way. The rain continued its relentless percussion against the windows, nature's own soundtrack to the confrontation unfolding within. Jimmy took a slow, deliberate sip of his coffee, his movements carrying the measured precision of someone who had faced far worse situations than 3 confrontational officers. The morning light caught the silver in his hair as he carefully set his cup down, aligning it perfectly with the saucer beneath, a small habit left over from decades of military discipline. "When I was about your age," he began, his voice carrying neither anger nor defensiveness, "I led a platoon through the jungles of Vietnam. One night, during a particularly heavy monsoon, we found ourselves pinned down by enemy fire. The rain was so thick you could barely see 3 feet ahead, much like the storm outside right now." The officers exchanged glances, a flicker of uncertainty crossing their faces at the calm authority in Jimmy's voice. Officer Reynolds shifted his weight, his earlier bravado slightly diminished. The diner remained silent, every patron and staff member hanging on Jimmy's words. "In my platoon was a young man named Tommy Martinez," Jimmy continued, his hand resting lightly on the worn photograph on his table. "He was a police officer's son from Chicago. Always talked about following in his father's footsteps when he got home. Said he wanted to protect and serve his community the way we were protecting our country." Sarah moved quietly among the tables, refilling coffee cups with subtle efficiency, her presence providing a gentle counterpoint to the tension. Through the windows, the storm continued its assault on the city, sheets of rain obscuring the view of the street outside. "Tommy never made it home to become a police officer." Jimmy's voice softened slightly. "He stepped on a landmine while leading a patrol. His last words were about hoping his dad would be proud of him." He paused, letting the weight of those words settle in the air. "I had to write the letter to his father, explaining how his son died protecting his fellow soldiers. It was the hardest letter I've ever written." Officer Blake's face had lost some of its cockiness, his hand unconsciously moving to touch his own badge. The parallel between Tommy's unrealized dreams and his own position wasn't lost on him. "The thing about service," Jimmy continued, straightening one of the papers on his desk with precise movements, "is that it comes in many forms. Sometimes it's wearing a uniform and patrolling the streets. Sometimes it's charging through a jungle carrying a wounded comrade. And sometimes," he gestured to the papers before him, "it's sitting in a diner, helping those who served navigate the battlefield of bureaucracy they face when they come home." The morning light had strengthened, breaking through the storm clouds momentarily to cast long shadows across the diner's worn floor. The American flag pin on Jimmy's collar caught the light, no longer seeming like just a piece of jewelry but rather a symbol of something much deeper. "These papers you mock," Jimmy picked up one document carefully. "This is a disability claim for a Marine who lost both legs in Fallujah. This one," he touched another, "is an appeal for a female Army veteran who can't get proper treatment for PTSD. Each one of these represents a person who put their life on the line for this country, just like Tommy did, just like I did, and yes, just like you do every day." Officer Morrison's hand had dropped from his belt, his earlier aggression replaced by something approaching shame. The parallel between their service and the veterans whose papers lay on Jimmy's table was becoming uncomfortably clear. "The uniform changes," Jimmy gestured to his crisp white shirt, "but the commitment to service doesn't. Whether it's a police uniform, military fatigues, or just a simple shirt with an American flag pin, what matters is the dedication to helping others, to protecting those who need protection, to serving those who have served." A long roll of thunder punctuated his words, as if nature itself was underlining their importance. The diner remained silent, the usual breakfast clatter completely forgotten as everyone listened to the quiet wisdom being shared in that corner booth. "So, before you judge someone based on appearances," Jimmy straightened his stack of papers with military precision, "remember that service comes in many forms, and heroes don't always wear uniforms. Sometimes they just sit quietly in diners, doing what needs to be done for those who've already given so much." The 3 officers stood in uncomfortable silence, their earlier bravado completely deflated by the quiet dignity of Jimmy's response. The badge on their chests, which had seemed like a symbol of authority moments ago, now felt heavier with the weight of responsibility it truly represented. The tense silence that had settled over the diner was suddenly broken by the sharp ring of the bell above the entrance door. A young woman in her early 30s entered, shaking rainwater from her umbrella. She wore military fatigues and carried herself with the unmistakable bearing of an active service member. Her eyes quickly scanned the diner before landing on Jimmy's corner booth, her face lighting up with recognition. "Mr. Sullivan," she called out, her voice carrying both respect and warmth. "I hope I'm not too early for our meeting." She made her way through the diner, navigating between tables with practiced efficiency. The three officers watched her approach, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and growing unease. As she reached Jimmy's table, she snapped to attention and rendered a crisp salute. "Staff Sergeant Maria Ramirez, sir. Thank you for agreeing to help with my brother's case." Jimmy returned her salute with equal precision, the movement so natural it seemed to take years off his age. "At ease, Staff Sergeant," Jimmy replied warmly, gesturing for her to take a seat. "I was just reviewing Carlos's paperwork." He pulled a file from his stack, and the officers could now see it was filled with medical records and VA forms, all meticulously organized and annotated. Maria settled into the booth, her back straight, shoulders squared. "It means so much that you're helping us, sir. After Carlos's injury in Afghanistan, we've been struggling to get his benefits sorted out. The VA keeps losing his paperwork, and with his traumatic brain injury, he can't handle the stress of fighting the system." The officers stood rooted to their spots, their earlier mockery of Jimmy's paperwork now casting long shadows over their consciences. Officer Blake shifted uncomfortably as he watched Jimmy pull out a detailed timeline he had constructed of Carlos's service and subsequent injury. "I've mapped out every hospital visit, every treatment, every form submission," Jimmy explained, his voice carrying the same quiet authority he had used with the officers. "The system has a way of wearing people down, making them give up. But we're not going to let that happen to Carlos." Sarah appeared with a fresh cup of coffee for Maria, her movement creating a momentary distraction from the thick tension still hanging in the air. Through the windows, the storm continued its assault on the city, but inside the diner, a different kind of atmosphere was developing. "Mr. Sullivan has helped dozens of veterans in our unit alone," Maria explained, unknowingly addressing the officer's earlier skepticism. "He's legendary at the VA office. They call him the Veteran's Guardian Angel, though he hates that nickname." She smiled warmly at Jimmy, who seemed slightly embarrassed by the praise. Thunder rolled outside as Jimmy spread out several documents on the table. "See here," he pointed to a specific form. "They rejected Carlos's claim because they said he missed a filing deadline. But I found evidence that the original paperwork was submitted on time. It just got lost in their system. We're going to appeal this decision, and we're going to win." Officer Reynolds watched as Jimmy's weathered hands moved across the papers with purpose and precision. Each movement spoke of years of experience, of countless hours spent fighting bureaucratic battles on behalf of others. The officer's earlier words about playing with papers now tasted bitter in his mouth. "Last month," Maria continued, her voice carrying a note of emotion, "Mr. Sullivan spent 3 days straight at the VA hospital with a veteran who had no family. The man was terminally ill, and Mr. Sullivan made sure he didn't die alone. He sat there, holding his hand, listening to his stories, making sure he knew his service wasn't forgotten." The diner had grown quiet again, but this time the silence was different, filled with respect rather than tension. The morning light, breaking through the storm clouds, cast a warm glow over Jimmy's table, illuminating the papers that each represented a life, a story, a battle still being fought long after the war had ended. "When Carlos came home," Maria's voice cracked slightly, "he was different. The IED blast took more than just his physical health. It took his smile, his peace of mind. But Mr. Sullivan here," she placed a hand on Jimmy's arm, "he understands. He's been there. He fights for veterans like Carlos because he knows what it's like to come home carrying invisible wounds." The officers exchanged glances, their earlier arrogance completely deflated by the reality unfolding before them. Through the diner's windows, they could see their patrol car, its lights occasionally reflecting off the rain-slicked streets. Their badges, which had seemed like shields of authority just minutes ago, now felt like symbols of a responsibility they had temporarily forgotten. At that moment, the diner's door chimed again, and two elderly men entered, both wearing Vietnam veteran caps adorned with service pins. They paused briefly, shaking off the rain, their eyes automatically scanning the room until they found Jimmy's booth. One walked with a noticeable limp, leaning heavily on a cane, while the other's empty right sleeve was pinned neatly to his jacket. "Jimmy," called out the man with the cane, "hope we're not interrupting." His voice carried the gravelly texture of age, but beneath it lay the unmistakable tone of military brotherhood. The three officers unconsciously stepped back, creating a path as the veterans made their way to Jimmy's booth. "George, Pete," Jimmy acknowledged them with a warm smile. "Right on time, as always." He began gathering some papers from his briefcase, pulling out two specific files with practiced efficiency. The officers watched as he handled each document with the same care a surgeon might show with their instruments. "These gentlemen," Jimmy explained to Maria, "served in the same area I did, though we didn't know each other then. George here," he nodded to the man with the cane, "was with the 173rd Airborne. Pete was a combat medic with the 25th Infantry Division. Now they help me locate other veterans who might need assistance but don't know where to turn." Sarah quickly brought additional chairs to the booth, her movements suggesting she'd done this many times before. The morning crowd had thinned, leaving the diner in that quiet lull between breakfast and lunch. The rain continued its steady drumming against the windows, creating a somber backdrop to the gathering. "Found another one yesterday," Pete said, his one arm reaching into his jacket pocket to pull out a crumpled piece of paper. "Vietnam vet, living in his car behind the old factory district. He's been trying to get his benefits for 3 years, but keeps getting lost in the system. Shows up at the VA hospital sometimes, but they can't help him without proper documentation." Jimmy took the paper, smoothing it carefully on the table. The officers could see his eyes scanning the information, his expression growing more determined with each line he read. "What's his condition?" he asked, already pulling out fresh forms from his briefcase. "Agent Orange exposure," George replied, his voice heavy with understanding. "Doctor says he's got maybe 6 months left. Been trying to get his benefits so he can spend his last days in proper care instead of his old Chevy." The words hung in the air, each one a testament to the ongoing battles veterans faced long after leaving the battlefield. Officer Blake found himself unconsciously touching his badge again, its weight suddenly feeling different. He watched as Jimmy began filling out forms with quick, precise movements, his handwriting clear and purposeful. Each stroke of his pen seemed to carry the weight of promises made to fellow soldiers, promises that extended far beyond the end of their service. "The VA's been overwhelmed since the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan," Jimmy explained as he worked, his voice carrying no accusation, just statement of fact. "Good people working there, but the system's complicated. Veterans like Maria's brother Carlos, or this gentleman Pete found, they need advocates. They need someone who understands both the system and what they've been through." The storm outside had intensified, rain now coming down in sheets. Lightning flashed, illuminating the diner in brief, stark bursts. In these flashes, the officers could see the faces around Jimmy's booth more clearly, each one marked by age and experience, each carrying stories of service and sacrifice. "Remember Tommy?" George asked Jimmy quietly, noticing the photograph on the table. "Days like this always remind me of him, that last night in the jungle." His voice trailed off, but the unspoken words hung heavy in the air. Pete reached over with his remaining arm, squeezing George's shoulder in silent understanding. Maria watched this interaction with quiet respect, her own experiences in Afghanistan creating an unspoken bond with these veterans of a different war. The brotherhood of service transcended generations, creating connections that civilians often struggled to understand. Jimmy continued working on the forms, but his voice carried clearly to where the officers stood. "Every morning I come here to this booth, not because I need a special place to sit, but because it's where veterans know they can find me. Some days it's paperwork, some days it's just listening to stories that need to be told. Sometimes," he paused, looking up at the officers, "it's about helping people understand that service doesn't end when you take off the uniform. The diner had grown unusually quiet, the only sounds being the rain outside and the scratch of Jimmy's pen on paper. The officers remained rooted in place, witnesses to a different kind of service than what they had mockingly dismissed earlier. As Jimmy continued working on the forms, Officer Reynolds noticed something unusual about the briefcase leaning against the booth. Partially visible beneath the worn leather was the distinct edge of what appeared to be a metal case. His police training had taught him to notice details, and this one caught his eye, particularly because of the distinctive shape and color that suggested something significant. "Mr. Sullivan," Officer Reynolds spoke up, his voice noticeably softer than before, "is that—" He hesitated, his eyes fixed on the edge of the case. Jimmy followed his gaze, a flash of recognition crossing his face. With careful movements, he reached down and pulled the metal case from beside his briefcase. "Wasn't planning on bringing this today," Jimmy said quietly, placing the case on the table. "Had to show it at a school presentation yesterday. Usually keeps it at home." The velvet-covered case was worn but well-maintained, bearing the clear marks of age and careful handling. Maria's eyes widened as Jimmy slowly opened the case. Inside, arranged with military precision, lay a collection of medals that told a story far more eloquent than words could convey. At the center, its distinctive blue ribbon slightly faded but still proud, sat the Medal of Honor. Surrounding it were other decorations: a silver star, bronze star with Valor device, Purple Heart, and several other combat decorations. The three officers stood transfixed, their earlier arrogance completely forgotten in the face of what lay before them. Officer Blake's hand trembled slightly as he recognized the significance of what he was seeing. The Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration, awarded for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty. "November 15th, 1968, George spoke up, his voice thick with emotion. "Just outside of Pleiku. Jimmy here." He paused, collecting himself. "Well, the citation tells it better than I could." Jimmy seemed uncomfortable with the attention, but Maria gently urged him, "Please, sir, they should know. We all should know." With reluctant movements, Jimmy pulled out a carefully folded paper from behind the medals, the official citation. The paper was worn at the creases, suggesting it had been unfolded and refolded many times over the years. His voice remained steady as he began to read, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty while serving as a platoon leader with Company D, 2nd Battalion, 503rd Infantry, 173rd Airborne Brigade in the Republic of Vietnam. When his platoon came under intense enemy fire and was pinned down in an exposed position, First Lieutenant Sullivan repeatedly exposed himself to enemy fire to direct his men's defensive efforts and to call in tactical air support." He paused, his eyes distant, seeing not the diner, but the jungle of half a century ago. The rain outside seemed to grow louder, its rhythm matching the tension in his voice as he continued. Despite being wounded twice, he organized a rescue of 3 wounded soldiers trapped in an exposed position. When the medical evacuation helicopter came under heavy fire, Lieutenant Sullivan ran into the open, drawing enemy fire to himself to allow the helicopter to safely extract the wounded. Though severely wounded himself, he refused evacuation until all his men were safe. The diner had grown completely silent. Even the kitchen staff had stopped their work, standing in respectful attention as Jimmy's words painted a picture of extraordinary courage and sacrifice. The officer's earlier mockery of his little flag pin now seemed not just disrespectful but profoundly ignorant. 14 men made it home that day because of what Jimmy did, Pete added quietly, his one hand gripping his coffee cup tightly. "I know because I was the medic who treated some of them when they got to the aid station." Officer Morrison found himself unconsciously standing at attention, his police training giving way to a deeper respect for the man before him. The metal case lay open on the table, its contents reflecting the diner's lights, each medal a testament to service and sacrifice that went far beyond anything they had imagined when they first— "That's why I do this." He gestured to the papers spread across the table. "Every veteran deserves to be remembered, to be helped, to be honored, not just the ones who received medals, but all of them." The 3 officers stood in stunned silence, Their earlier bravado completely evaporated. Officer Reynolds, who had been the most vocal in his mockery, felt the weight of his badge grow heavier with each passing moment. The rain outside had softened to a gentle patter, as if nature itself was pausing to honor the revelation that had just unfolded. "Mr. Sullivan," Officer Reynolds finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. We... He struggled to find words adequate to address their earlier behavior. The gap between their assumptions and the reality of who sat before them seemed impossibly wide. Jimmy raised his hand slightly, the same calm authority present in his gesture. "You serve your community every day," he said, his voice carrying no resentment. "That's what matters. We all have our battles to fight, our ways to make a difference. The uniform might be different, but the commitment to service is the same." Maria sat quietly, watching the interaction with understanding in her eyes. As a current service member, she recognized the profound impact this moment would have on the young officers. She had seen similar transformations before, moments when perception shattered and understanding rushed in to fill the void. "Sir," Officer Blake stepped forward, his posture unconsciously shifting to attention. "My grandfather served in Vietnam. He never talked about it. Passed away last year, still fighting with the VA over his Agent Orange exposure. If I had known there were people like you, helping veterans navigate the system." Jimmy nodded, understanding the unspoken regret in the officer's voice. He pulled a card from his briefcase and handed it to Blake. "The community center where I work. We're always looking for volunteers. Many veterans feel more comfortable talking to law enforcement officers. You understand service, dedication, sacrifice. Sometimes that common ground is all it takes to help someone open up." The card was simple, just an address and phone number for the Veterans Support Center. But in Blake's hands, it felt like a bridge between his current service and a deeper understanding of what service truly meant. Officer Morrison, who had been silent for several minutes, suddenly remembered something. "The homeless veteran camp under the Harrison Street Bridge. We patrol past it every day. There must be at least a dozen men there." "I know the camp," Jimmy replied, already pulling out a fresh notepad. "Give me the best time to visit. They might be more willing to accept help if they see me accompanied by officers they recognize. Trust has to be built carefully with our homeless veterans. Too many have been let down, too many times." The dynamic in the diner had shifted completely. Where there had been tension and mockery, there was now a quiet sense of purpose. Sarah moved among the tables, refilling coffee cups, watching as a new kind of understanding built between the officers and the veteran they had so quickly judged. "We can coordinate with community services," Officer Reynolds offered, his earlier arrogance replaced by genuine eagerness to help. "Our department has resources, connections. Maybe we can help create a better system for identifying veterans in need." Jimmy looked up from his notepad, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "That's exactly the kind of bridge building we need. Too often, our veterans fall through the cracks because different services don't communicate effectively. Police officers are often the first to encounter veterans in crisis." George and Pete exchanged knowing looks. They had seen this before, Jimmy's ability to turn confrontation into collaboration, to find common ground where others saw only divisions. It was this skill, as much as his medals, that made him so effective in helping veterans. "When does the support center open?" Officer Blake asked, holding the card Jimmy had given him as if it were something precious. I'd like to start volunteering. Maybe help other families avoid what happened with my grandfather." The morning light had strengthened, breaking through the clouds to cast long rays across the diner's worn floor. The American flag pin on Jimmy's collar caught the light, no longer a target for mockery, but a symbol of something the officers now understood far more deeply. "We open at 7 every morning," Jimmy replied, writing something additional on a piece of paper. "But the work never really stops. Every veteran's story is different, every need unique. Sometimes it's paperwork, sometimes it's just having someone who understands listen. The important thing is showing up, being there, making a difference where you can." Officer Reynolds pulled out his department notebook, its pages still crisp and clean compared to Jimmy's well-worn papers. "I want to get this right," he said. his voice carrying a new humility. "We patrol past several areas where we regularly see veterans. Maybe we could create some kind of outreach program. Coordinate with your center?" Jimmy nodded approvingly, watching as the young officer wrote with the same dedication he had earlier mocked in others. The transformation unfolding before him was familiar. He had seen it many times over the years, though rarely so dramatically. The rain outside had settled into a gentle drizzle, sunlight occasionally breaking through to cast warm patches across the diner's floor. "The hardest part," Jimmy explained, spreading out a map of the city he pulled from his briefcase, "is building trust. Many veterans, especially those who've fallen through the cracks, have learned to be wary of authority. They've been promised help before, only to be let down. That's why consistency is crucial." Maria leaned forward, her military training evident in how she studied the map. "In my unit," she offered, "we've started a peer support program. Maybe we could connect it with the police department's community outreach, create a network of support that covers more ground." The three officers gathered around the table now, their earlier antagonism forgotten in the face of purposeful planning. Officer Blake pointed to several locations on the map, places where they regularly encountered homeless veterans during their patrols. Jimmy marked each spot with careful precision, adding notes about best times for outreach and specific needs they'd observed. "Look here," Pete spoke up, his one arm gesturing to a particular intersection. "The old warehouse district. There's a group of Desert Storm vets who've been camping there for months. They're proud men, won't usually accept help, but they might listen to fellow veterans, especially if they see police officers working with us instead of just moving them along." George nodded, adding his own insights. "Winter's coming too. We need to act fast. Last year we lost 2 veterans to exposure because they refused to go to shelters. Trust issues, PTSD. They felt safer on the streets than in crowded indoor spaces." Officer Morrison's face showed recognition. "I think I know one of the men you're talking about. Tall guy carries an old Marine Corps backpack. He always stands at attention when we drive by, even though he can barely walk." "That's Marcus," Jimmy confirmed, pulling out another file. 3 tours in Iraq, Bronze Star recipient. He's been trying to get his disability claim approved for 2 years, but the paperwork keeps getting lost. Every time he has to restart the process, it takes a piece of his hope away. Sarah appeared with fresh coffee, but this time she wasn't just serving. She was part of the conversation. "The diner could help too," she offered. "We already keep Jimmy's booth reserved, but maybe we could do more. A warm meal, a safe space for veterans to meet with counselors or fill out paperwork." Jimmy smiled at her suggestion. "That's exactly the kind of community support we need. It's not just about government programs or official services. It's about creating a network of people who care, who understand, who are willing to help in whatever way they can." Officer Reynolds had filled several pages in his notebook by now. His writing was rushed but determined, each note a step away from his earlier prejudice and toward a deeper understanding of service. "We could start with training," he suggested. "Help officers recognize the signs that someone might be a veteran in need. Teach them about resources available, how to make appropriate referrals. And more importantly," Officer Blake added, "help us understand what not to do. Like today." His voice trailed off, embarrassment coloring his face. "We could have handled things so differently." Jimmy watched as the young officers continued planning, their eager suggestions now focused on helping rather than harming. The transformation reminded him of his own journey, how his understanding of service had evolved from battlefield courage to this quieter, equally vital form of warfare against bureaucracy and indifference. "Every morning," he said, his voice cutting through the excited planning, "I sit in this booth not because I need a special place, but because it's where veterans know they can find help. It's about consistency, reliability. When you're lost in the system, knowing there's one fixed point where you can get help, that can make all the difference." Maria nodded in understanding. "It's like a command post," she said, her military training providing the perfect analogy. "A place where operations are coordinated, where resources can be directed to where they're needed most." The diner had begun to fill up again with the approaching lunch crowd, but the new arrivals seemed to sense the importance of what was happening in Jimmy's booth. They found tables farther away, their conversations hushed, respectful of the planning session taking place in the corner. "This could be the start of something significant," Officer Reynolds said, looking up from his notes. "A real partnership between law enforcement and veteran services, something that could make a genuine difference in people's lives." The diner's door chimed again, and this time an elderly man entered, leaning heavily on a walker. His jacket, though weathered, was meticulously clean, with a faded Vietnam veteran patch sewn carefully on the shoulder. The three officers immediately recognized him. They'd seen him numerous times during their patrols, usually sitting alone on a bench near the public library. "That's Robert Johnson," Officer Morrison whispered, recognition dawning on his face. "We've tried to approach him several times, but he always waves us away. Says he doesn't need any help." Jimmy stood up slowly, straightening his shirt with military precision. "Robert," he called out softly, "good to see you made it through the rain." The elderly veteran looked up, his eyes brightening with recognition as he spotted Jimmy. "Couldn't miss our appointment, Sarge," Robert replied, his voice carrying a slight tremor. "Got those papers you asked for." He began making his slow way toward the booth, each step deliberate and carefully measured. Officer Blake instinctively moved to help, but Jimmy raised his hand slightly, stopping him. "Let him do it himself," he said quietly. "Dignity is sometimes all a veteran has left. Robert's been walking on his own since '69, and he'll do it today too." The officers watched as Robert made his way across the diner, noting how other patrons respectfully made space for him without making it obvious they were doing so. Sarah appeared with a fresh cup of coffee, placing it at the spot that had seemingly materialized at Jimmy's table. "Robert here," Jimmy explained as the elderly veteran finally reached them, "was a tunnel rat in Vietnam, spent months crawling through underground passages that would give most people nightmares. Now he's fighting a different kind of battle, trying to get the VA to acknowledge his Agent Orange exposure." Robert settled into his seat with a quiet grunt, pulling a manila envelope from inside his jacket. His hands shook slightly as he handed it to Jimmy, but his eyes were clear and determined. "Medical records from '71, he said. "Found them in an old footlocker. Doctor said they might help with the claim." Officer Reynolds watched as Jimmy carefully opened the envelope, handling the age documents with reverent care. These weren't just papers. They were pieces of a man's life, evidence of sacrifices made and prices paid. "Look at this," Jimmy said, pointing to a particular entry. "Documentation of respiratory issues immediately after return from service. This could be crucial for your claim, Robert. They can't ignore contemporary medical evidence." Maria leaned forward, her current military service giving her a unique perspective on the generational bridge being built before her. "Sir," she addressed Robert, "my brother's fighting the VA too. Mr. Sullivan here, he's helping us both." Robert's eyes moved from Maria's face to her uniform, then to the officers standing nearby. For a moment, tension crept into his posture, but Jimmy's presence seemed to reassure him. "Different wars," he said quietly. "Same battles afterward." "Mr. Johnson," Officer Blake stepped forward, his earlier swagger replaced by genuine respect. "We've seen you near the library. We didn't understand before, but we'd like to help now, if you'll let us." Robert studied the young officer's face, decades of experience helping him read the sincerity there. "Used to avoid uniforms," he admitted. "Reminded me too much of what I lost. But maybe it's time to stop running." Jimmy continued examining the medical records, making careful notes on a legal pad. "Robert's been living alone since his wife passed," he explained to the officers. "Pride kept him from seeking help, even when the symptoms started getting worse. But he's a fighter, always has been." Sarah brought over a plate of toast, unasked for but clearly welcome, judging by Robert's grateful nod. The morning light had strengthened now, creating a warm glow that seemed to soften the harsh edges of difficult memories being shared. "We could arrange regular wellness checks," Officer Reynolds suggested carefully. "Not as police officers, just as people who care. Make sure you have what you need. Help you get to appointments. Robert's hands tightened slightly around his coffee cup, but he didn't immediately reject the offer. Progress, Jimmy knew, came in small steps. Might be good to have someone check in now and then, he conceded quietly, especially with winter coming. The transformation in the diner was complete now, from a place of confrontation to one of connection, from misunderstanding to mutual respect. The officers who had entered full of judgment now stood as allies, their badges representing not just authority but responsibility to serve all members of their community. Each veteran's story is different, Jimmy said, carefully returning the medical records to their envelope. But they all deserve to be heard, to be helped, to be honored. Sometimes it takes a whole community, police officers, fellow veterans, caring citizens, to make that happen. As the morning stretched toward noon, the diner had become more than just a breakfast spot. It had transformed into an impromptu command center for veteran support. The three officers who had entered with mockery in their hearts now sat with notebooks open, actively engaging in what would become a new chapter in their department's community outreach. "We could start immediately," Officer Reynolds said, his voice carrying the enthusiasm of genuine purpose. "Our shift schedules already cover the areas where most veterans gather. Instead of just passing by, we could use that time to build relationships, identify needs, connect people with resources." Jimmy nodded approvingly as he organized the various papers and files that had accumulated on the table. The morning's confrontation seemed like a distant memory now, replaced by something far more productive. Sarah moved among them, refreshing coffee cups and quietly bearing witness to the transformation taking place in her diner. "The key," Jimmy explained, pulling out a fresh sheet of paper, "is consistency. These men and women have faced enough broken promises. If we say we're going to be somewhere, we need to be there. If we offer help, we need to follow through. Trust, once lost, is twice as hard to rebuild." Maria, still in her fatigues, added her perspective. "In active service, we never leave anyone behind. That principle shouldn't end when we take off the uniform. Every veteran on the street is one of our own who we failed to bring home completely." The rain outside had finally stopped, and sunlight streamed through the windows, creating long shadows across the diner floor. Robert sat quietly, listening to the plans being made, occasionally nodding in agreement. His presence served as a living testament to both the challenges veterans faced and the possibility of bridging the gap between those who needed help and those who could provide it. "What about the community center?" Officer Blake asked, holding up the card Jimmy had given him earlier. "You said you're always looking for volunteers. Maybe we could establish a regular police presence there, not for enforcement but for support." "That could work," Jimmy replied, making a note. "Many veterans, especially those who've had troubled pasts, are hesitant to approach police officers. But if they see you regularly at the center working alongside us, helping others, it changes the dynamic, shows them you're there to help, not judge." George and Pete, who had remained quiet during much of the planning, shared knowing looks. They had seen similar transformations before, moments when barriers broke down and understanding took root. The diner had become a crucible for change, turning confrontation into collaboration. "I've got a list," Robert spoke up suddenly, his voice stronger than before. "Names of guys I know, veterans who need help but don't know how to ask for it. Been keeping it in my head, afraid to trust anyone with it. Maybe now's the time to share it." Officer Morrison pulled out a fresh page in his notebook, pen ready. "We're ready to listen, sir. Whatever you can tell us will help." The respect in his voice was genuine, a far cry from the arrogant tone he had used earlier that morning. As Robert began sharing names and locations, Jimmy watched the officers taking notes with the same dedication they had previously scorned in him. Each name represented a story, a life, a chance for redemption, not just for the veterans who needed help, but for a system learning to serve them better. "There's Thomas at the old rail yard," Robert continued, his voice growing stronger with each name shared. "Served in Desert Storm, lost his family to divorce, his home to medical bills. Proud man, won't take charity, but he might accept help from another veteran, especially if he sees the police are on our side." Sarah, who had been quietly supportive throughout the morning, stepped forward. "The diner could help too," she suggested. "Maybe we could start a program, Veterans Helping Veterans. Use this space as a meeting point, a safe place where people can come for a warm meal and find the help they need." "A hub," Jimmy nodded, the concept taking shape. "A place where different services can come together. Veteran support, law enforcement, community resources. Sometimes the hardest part is knowing where to start. Having one central location, a place people know they can find help." Officer Reynolds had filled several pages now, his neat handwriting detailing plans, contacts, and ideas. "We could coordinate with other precincts too," he suggested. "Make this a department-wide initiative. Train officers to recognize signs of veteran status, understand common issues, know what resources are available." The morning light had shifted, casting different shadows now, but the sense of purpose in the diner remained strong. What had begun as a confrontation had evolved into something none of them could have predicted, a blueprint for change, a bridge between communities, a chance to make a real difference. "Sometimes," Jimmy said quietly, looking at the papers spread across his table, "the biggest battles aren't fought with weapons. They're fought with understanding, with patience, with the willingness to see beyond our first judgments. Every veteran's story is different, but they all deserve to be heard." The afternoon sun now streamed through the diner's windows, casting long shadows across the well-worn floor. The morning's dramatic transformation from confrontation to collaboration had left an indelible mark on everyone present. As Jimmy began gathering his papers, carefully placing each document back into his briefcase, Officer Reynolds stood up, squaring his shoulders with newfound purpose. "Mr. Sullivan," he said, his voice carrying the weight of genuine respect. "I know an apology isn't enough for how we acted earlier, but I hope you'll let us prove ourselves through actions instead of words." Jimmy looked up from his briefcase, a gentle smile crossing his weathered face. "In Vietnam," he replied, "we had a saying, 'The best way forward is to march together.' You've already taken the first step by choosing to understand rather than judge. That's more valuable than any apology." The diner had begun its transition from morning to afternoon service, but Sarah had kept their corner undisturbed, recognizing the importance of what was unfolding. The other patrons who had witnessed the morning's events occasionally glanced their way, many nodding in respect as they left. "We'll start tomorrow," Officer Blake said, clutching his notebook filled with plans and contacts. "First shift, we'll begin mapping out all the locations Robert mentioned. Start building those relationships just like you taught us." Maria stood, straightening her uniform with military precision. "I need to head back to base," she said, "but I'll spread the word through our support networks. The more we can coordinate between active duty personnel and veteran services, the stronger our safety net becomes." George and Pete exchanged knowing looks before Pete spoke up. "You know, Jimmy," he said, his one arm gesturing to the officers, "sometimes the best victories come from the battles we never expected to fight." Robert, who had remained quietly observant through much of the planning, slowly pushed himself to his feet. "Never thought I'd see the day," he admitted, looking at the officers, "when I'd feel hopeful about dealing with uniforms again. Maybe an old dog can learn new tricks after all." Officer Morrison stepped forward, offering to help Robert with his walker, but this time the gesture carried respect rather than pity. "Sir," he said quietly, "would you be willing to help us understand? Share your experiences? It would make us better officers." The elderly veteran studied him for a moment before nodding slowly. "Come by the library bench sometime," he replied. "Been sitting on those stories for too long anyway." Jimmy watched this exchange with satisfaction, seeing bridges being built where walls had stood just hours before. He reached into his briefcase one last time, pulling out a stack of business cards for the Veterans Support Center. "Remember," he said, handing them to the officers, "every veteran you meet is fighting battles we can't see. Sometimes the simplest act of understanding can be the difference between despair and hope." Sarah approached their table, carrying a fresh pot of coffee. "Jimmy's booth will always be here," she announced. But maybe now it'll become more than just one man's mission. Maybe it'll become a symbol of what can happen when people choose to understand each other. The three officers stood at attention, a gesture that now came from genuine respect rather than professional habit. Officer Reynolds spoke for them all. "We'll make you proud, sir. Not just today or tomorrow, but every day. What we learned here, it changes everything." Jimmy closed his briefcase with a gentle click, the sound somehow symbolizing the closing of one chapter and the opening of another. "Pride isn't what I'm looking for," he replied. "Just remember that every veteran you meet could be another Tommy, another Robert, another story waiting to be heard and helped." Through the diner's windows, the city continued its daily rhythm, unaware of the small revolution that had taken place within these walls. Cars passed, people hurried by, life went on. But for those gathered around Jimmy's booth, something fundamental had shifted. "Before you go," Jimmy said, reaching for the worn photograph of himself and Tommy, "remember this. Every uniform, whether it's military, police, or even a simple shirt with a flag pin, carries with it a responsibility to serve others. How we fulfill that responsibility, that's what defines us." As they prepared to part ways, each person carrying with them new understanding and purpose, the sun broke fully through the clouds, flooding the diner with warm light. The American flag pin on Jimmy's collar caught the light, no longer a target for mockery but a symbol of service that transcended uniforms and generations. Sarah watched from behind the counter as handshakes and promises were exchanged, each one carrying the weight of genuine commitment. The diner had hosted countless meals and conversations over the years, but few had carried the transformative power of this morning's events. "Same time tomorrow, Jimmy?" she called out as he gathered his things. "Same time tomorrow," he confirmed with a smile. "There's always more work to be done, more stories to be heard, more battles to be fought, not with weapons, but with understanding and compassion." As they filed out of the diner, each person carried with them a piece of the morning's lesson. The officers had learned that true service goes beyond the badge. The veterans had found new allies in their ongoing battles, and Jimmy had once again transformed confrontation into opportunity. The bell above the door chimed one final time as they left, its sound somehow different now. Not an ending, but a beginning. The morning storm had cleared, leaving behind not just clearer skies, but clearer understanding, stronger purpose, and renewed hope for all who had witnessed the power of service, sacrifice, and redemption. Officers humiliate a veteran in a diner, but when they see it on his desk. Stay until the end of the video to experience the song Honor's Echo that perfectly captures the heart of this story. Don't miss it. What began as a morning of prejudice and mockery transformed into a powerful lesson in service and understanding. Three young police officers who ridiculed an elderly veteran at Murphy's Diner for his paperwork and flag pin discovered that appearances can be deceiving. Jimmy Sullivan, a quiet Vietnam veteran with a Medal of Honor and a lifetime dedicated to helping fellow veterans, turned their contempt into comprehension through his dignified response and remarkable story of sacrifice. The revelation of his medals, including the nation's highest military decoration, served as a bridge between generations of service members. More importantly, his daily mission of helping veterans navigate the complex VA system showed the officers that service continues long after the uniform comes off. The confrontation evolved into collaboration as the officers learned about Jimmy's vital work at the Veterans Support Center. What started as mockery ended in a partnership, with the police officers pledging to help identify and assist veterans in need during their patrols. As the morning drew to a close, Sarah, the diner's owner, witnessed more than just a change of heart. She saw the birth of a new community initiative. Jimmy's regular booth would now become a symbol of hope and unity, where veterans could find help and understanding. The officers left Murphy's Diner that day with more than just regret for their earlier behavior. They carried with them a deeper understanding of service, sacrifice, and the ongoing battles many veterans face. Their badges now felt heavier, with the weight of newfound responsibility and respect for those who served before them. Jimmy's quiet dignity and unwavering dedication to helping others had transformed another confrontation into an opportunity for change, proving that sometimes the greatest victories come from the battles we never expected to fight.